Hey guys, first of all I want to apologize. I know it's been a few weeks since my last video. It's just I've been very busy with a lot of stuff in my personal life. Nothing bad by any means, just a lot of work-related stuff, and also, as I've gotten older, I've become a much slower reader, so the book I'm about to review kinda took me a while to get through, even though I've read the book before, but the book I'm reviewing is Cujo by Stephen King, which is a book I've actually reviewed twice before on this channel. I first reviewed Cujo all the way back in 2011. It was one of my first reviews, and that review was horrible because I didn't know what the hell I was doing, so I redid it in 2014, but I decided I wanted to read Cujo again, and if I'm reading it again, I might as well talk about it again in a video, and hopefully this will be my final word on this book. Now, Cujo is a horror novel published in 1981, and is one of King's most recognizable titles. Like, the minute you say Cujo to somebody, even if they only have a pass-in knowledge of Stephen King, they'll immediately recognize it as a Stephen King novel, regardless of whether they read a single book by him or not. And this is one of the Stephen King stories that really has made an impact on pop culture. Now, Cujo was never one of my favorite Stephen King books, but I do recognize its significance and its importance in the history of King's career, and upon rereading it, it is honestly a pretty good book, and I've certainly noticed some nuances that I didn't necessarily appreciate when I first read the book over a decade ago. Now, Stephen King has famously said that he doesn't even remember writing Cujo, because for those of you who don't know, during this period of King's life, he was a major alcoholic, and I know he also had a major coke problem as well, although I think his cocaine addiction came later. Now, when he says that he doesn't remember writing this book, what he actually means is the period when he was writing this is just kind of a blur now, but I feel like it's kind of evolved into sort of an apocryphal story that a lot of fans would like to believe is true, that he just had a really bad bender one night and woke up the next morning hungover and the manuscript for Cujo was in his lap. Obviously that's not what happened, but that would have been freaking hilarious. What happened last night? Maybe Tabby's right. Maybe I should stop What the hell is Cujo? Now, Stephen King actually got the name Cujo from real-life domestic terrorist Willie Wolfe, who sometimes went by the nickname Cujo, who was one of the founding members of the Symbionese Liberation Army, who are the group responsible for the kidnapping and brainwashing of Patty Hearst. Which is kind of a random thing for this book about a killer dog to be named after, but King does kind of play on that in the book, where at one point Donna wonders why the hell this dog is named after a member of the SLA. Now, Stephen King seems to have a weird fascination with this group, because I know he said that Donald D. Freeze, the leader of the Symbionese Liberation Army, was his main inspiration for Randall Flagg from The Stand in the Dark Tower book. And I heard that Stephen King always wanted to do a book about the SLA, but that never came to fruition. Now, what's interesting about this book is it actually starts out as kind of a semi-sequel to King's 1979 novel, The Dead Zone. Not only is this set in the fictional town of Castle Rock, Maine, which was first introduced in The Dead Zone, but several characters from that book also show up in this, most notably George Bannerman, who is the sheriff of Castle Rock in both novels. And also, both John Smith, who is the main character of The Dead Zone, and Frank Dodd, who is the serial killer that Johnny was helping the Castle Rock PD go after in the first half of that novel, are mentioned literally right on the opening page of this book, because you find out in Cujo that Frank Dodd had taken on sort of a boogeyman-like status in the town. Now, today most Stephen King fans realize that a large portion of his novels take place in the same universe, but this was really, I think, the first Stephen King book where you really started to notice him merging his stories into one continuity. Now, the basic plot of Cujo is actually really simple. However, the overall story is actually a little more complex than you might be expecting. But the basic story of Cujo is it follows a dog, a Saint Bernard, named Cujo, who one day is chasing a rabbit through a field, and he chases the rabbit into this small cave and startles some bats. One of these bats ends up biting him on the nose, and it turns out this bat had rabies, and Cujo ends up contracting the disease. So as the novel progresses, Cujo is becoming more and more rabid, something that his owners, a family called the Campers, are completely unaware of. But the novel primarily focuses on this 29 to 30-year-old housewife named Donna Trenton, who's having car troubles, and she decides to take her car to Joe Camper, who is a mechanic, who lives sort of on the outskirts of town in a very isolated area. So, being completely unaware of what's going on with Cujo, she goes out there with her 4-year-old son, Tad, and the car ends up breaking down right in front of Joe Camper's place, which normally would be great. I mean, the guy's a mechanic, but he's nowhere to be seen, and it appears that the only living soul for miles around is Cujo, a dog that at this point has completely succumbed to rabies. So, if Donna and Tad leave the car, they run the risk of getting mauled by a rabid dog, but also staying there is kind of a problem too, because they're out in the baking sun, and there's no air conditioner, and the car can't go anywhere, and they're also running low on food and water, and also, nobody knows they're out there. Now, all the stuff of Donna getting trapped in the car with Tad actually doesn't happen till relatively late into the story, and the book actually starts out as sort of a domestic melodrama, really about these two families, the Trentons and the Cambers. Now, on the surface, everything appears to be fine for these two families, but underneath, like behind closed doors, we realize there's a lot of problems happening in both these households, and the stories of these two families is sort of tied together with what's going on with Cujo. In the Trentons' case, we learn that Donna was actually cheating on her husband Vic with this guy named Steve Kemp, who turns out to be a real freaking creep, and when she breaks it off with him, he loses it and he starts stalking her, and he also sends an anonymous letter to her husband, to Vic, basically explaining what's been going on. So now it appears that this marriage might be going down the tubes. And then with the Campers, we learn that Joe Camper is not only a misogynistic asshole, but he's also extremely abusive towards his wife, and it's implied that he's sort of abusive towards his son as well, although he does seem to treat his son a little bit better than he treats his wife. And Charity Camper, Joe's wife, is trying to get away from him and take their son with her, and when she wins the lottery, she sees this as her opportunity to get away. So you have a lot of family drama going on in the first half of the novel, and you have these two narratives that ultimately kind of converge when Cujo starts to fully succumb to the rabies. And one of the major themes of the novel is fear. Donna is afraid of her marriage falling apart because of this horrible mistake that she made, and she's also afraid of growing old, and growing old in a place that is unfamiliar to her because she's not originally from Castle Rock. Her husband kind of moved her and Tad out there for business reasons. And it turns out that Vic, even before he finds out that Donna is cheating on him, is already dealing with his own fears. He's afraid of financial ruin because the ad agency that he works for, it turns out the cereal company that they represent is starting to go under because there's been a public health scare involving this food dye that the cereal uses, so now he's afraid of financial ruin and also afraid of, again, the marriage falling apart when he finds out what's been going on with Donna. And then paralleling Donna's fears, you have Charity's fears. She's afraid of being stuck in this abusive marriage for the rest of her life, and even more than that, she's afraid of her son Brett becoming just like Joe as he gets older. And then you have Tad, who's afraid of a monster in his closet, and Cujo ends up representing the collective fears that all these characters have. But the book also ends up being sort of a melodrama about small-town life, and again, this is set 5 years after the events of the Dead Zone, and we learn that this community is still reeling from the killing spree committed by Frank Dodd all those years earlier. And even though Frank Dodd is long dead at this point, it almost appears as if his specter hangs over the entire town like some kind of an evil ghost. But another theme in the novel I saw is trust, and what happens when trust is broken, like when Donna is unfaithful to Vic, and also with Vic, the cereal company that his ad agency represents, their mascot is this fictional professor that Vic actually helped create, who goes on TV talking about why this cereal is so great, and even though he's a completely fictional character, he's somebody that the public trusts, and when this health scare happens, that trust is broken. And then with Tad, even though this is of no fault of Donna or Vic's, you see how his trust in his parents lets him down. And then that's all symbolized with Cujo. Dog is supposed to be man's best friend. You're supposed to trust that the family dog isn't going to attack the family, and that's the real crux of the horror of the novel. And then you can tie that all in with Frank Dodd. Frank Dodd was a cop, somebody that the community of Castle Rock trusted, and they didn't realize that this man that they were putting their faith in was an actual human monster. Another theme in the novel is avoidance, and what happens when you ignore a certain problem before it spirals out of control. Like Brett, the boy in the Camber family, he notices very quickly that something is not right about Cujo, and he brings it up to his mother, Charity, and then she says, "Don't tell your father about this," because she's desperate to have this vacation with her son to go see her sister, which you realize is sort of her way of getting away from Joe, and she doesn't want anything to get in the way of this, which in a way you could say is kind of selfish on her part, but at the same time we have to realize that this is a battered wife trying to get away from an abusive relationship, so you don't really blame Charity in that regard, but at the same time, if they would have done something sooner about Cujo, none of this would have happened. And to tie that in with the sharp cereal professor, the fictional mascot of the cereal company that Vic's ad agency represents, his catchphrase is, "Nope. Nothing wrong here." Now, to talk a little bit about the characters in the novel, Donna is ostensibly the protagonist of the book, and I like how, even though she was unfaithful to Vic, at no point does Stephen King demonize her for what she did. Which I think was really important, especially because I know a common criticism of a lot of Stephen King's earlier work, even among some of his hardcore fans, is how he sometimes portrays women in his stories. And the whole situation of Donna getting trapped in the car with Tad with Cujo outside, King could have easily done something where it's like, oh, this is God's punishment on her for her infidelity, but at no point do I think that's happening. I know some people have that interpretation, but really I think this is just shitty luck. What's happening to Donna is just bad luck, and it's also kind of about how bad things sometimes happen to good people, and Donna is a good person. Yeah, I don't agree with cheating, but again, the book never demonizes Donna. But Vic is also a very likable character, and again, even though the story doesn't necessarily demonize Donna, it does show that Vic definitely didn't deserve what Donna did to him. And when Vic finds out, he's understandably angry and deeply upset, but at the same time, he's still trying to make it work. He's still trying to reach out to Donna and kind of understand her perspective, and I really appreciated how in this domestic drama with Donna and Vic, King is really showing both sides of the fence. Another character that really stands out in this book is Steve Kemp, the man that Donna is having the affair with, and Steve is a real nasty piece of work. But it's interesting because Steve is also a writer. Now, Stephen King constantly uses writers as the characters in his stories, but normally when he has a writer in his stories, the writer is usually the protagonist or one of the protagonists. So it's interesting that King uses the writer character as basically the secondary antagonist of the novel. But it's also interesting that Steve Kemp has the same initials as Stephen King. Now, King has been self-deprecating before, but I'm not really sure what King is trying to say, having this character who could be ostensibly seen as a stand-in for him as basically a villain in the story. Now, to talk about Cujo himself, Cujo is probably one of Stephen King's most sympathetic villains because it's not the dog's fault. The dog is just severely sick and can't help what he's doing, and there are certain points in the book that are actually told from Cujo's perspective, which could have been really silly, but Stephen King does it surprisingly well and surprisingly realistically. And King does a great job showing just how much pain and agony this poor creature is in. And there's a really heartbreaking moment in the book. It's the last time that Brett sees Cujo, and it talks about how Cujo is about to attack him, but it takes everything in Cujo's power not to. Now, Cujo is often considered to be one of King's more reality-based stories in the sense that the basic premise could arguably happen in real life. Granted, what happens in the story does kind of rely a lot on coincidence, but the plot is at least plausible. But even though the plot is a little more realistic than your typical Stephen King story, this book does have a subtle undercurrent of the supernatural. For example, in the beginning of the story, Tad is seeing a monster in his closet. Now, granted, you could take this as a child's imagination. I mean, we were all afraid of the boogeyman growing up. Like, when I was a little kid, I was terrified that a vacuum cleaner in my room was an alien. At the same time, the book heavily implies that there actually is some kind of supernatural presence in Tad's closet. For example, there are a few moments where Donna is cleaning Tad's room and she feels like something is watching her from the closet, and there's certain points where the door should be closed but it opens and there's nobody there to open it, so the book is heavily insinuating that something is in his closet. Now, real or fake, narratively and symbolically, the monster in Tad's closet is supposed to be sort of an allegory for the troubles in the Trentons' marriage, and is supposed to be sort of foreshadowing of the horror that is to come. But if you want to interpret the monster literally, there's a lot of fan theories that you could have, like maybe whatever presence is in Tad's closet is actually possessing Cujo, or at the very least is influencing Cujo in some way. And a lot of fans think that this presence is actually the ghost of Frank Dodd. And in fact, when Sheriff Bannerman, who again was a major character from the Dead Zone, finally shows up in this story and he first sees Cujo, he says something to the effect of, "Who let you out of hell, Frank?" And again, that's a common fan theory that Cujo is actually being possessed by Frank Dodd. I'm not sure if I completely agree with that theory, however. I definitely think there's something up with Tad's closet, but at the same time, I think Cujo is ultimately just a sick dog. But it's almost kind of random in a way that you have these supernatural elements in a story where the main conflict is not necessarily supernatural. Like, it's almost as if you had a whole other story in the process of happening, and that story ends up getting interrupted by this whole incident with Cujo. Another possible supernatural element in the story, now when Donna and Tad are trapped in this car, Vic is away on business and he has no way of knowing what's going on with them, but there's one point where he has a nightmare where Donna and Tad are trapped in this cave and a monster is trying to get at them. Now, you could take this dream as just a coincidence, Or maybe it's some kind of premonition that Vic is having, and being that this is in the same universe as the Dead Zone, we know psychic phenomenon does exist in this universe. But ultimately, I think the supernatural elements in the story are meant to be more like red herrings, to sort of mislead the reader into thinking that this is going to be a very different kind of story, that there actually is going to be some kind of supernatural explanation for why Cujo went rabid, and why this misfortune befell Donna and Tad, when it's almost scarier to think that this was just some random event that happened, and sometimes shit happens. So yeah, Cujo. It is honestly a really good book. It's not one of my favorite Stephen King novels, but I understand why so many people do consider it to be one of his best, and it does have some of the best characterization of any of Stephen King's novels, which really shouldn't come as any surprise, because characters was always Stephen King's strong suit, I think. My only real criticism of the book is, even though this is one of King's shorter books, I actually think the novel could have been shorter, if we're being honest. Like, there are certain subplots and certain details that I didn't necessarily need, like, all the stuff dealing with the ad agency and the cereal company. Like, it was interesting, but I didn't need page after page after page about all that. But overall, if you are a Stephen King fan, the book is well worth the read. Now, to briefly bring up the ending of this book, this is one of King's bleakest and most nihilistic endings. Like, things do not end well at all for the characters in this book. But as depressing as the ending is, I still appreciated it because sometimes in real life, things do not work out and things do not end well. But the ending of this book is not just a gut punch, it's a punch in the gut and the nuts at the same time. Now, besides the Dead Zone, I do want to talk about other connections to King's larger body of work that this book has. Now, if we want to go with the theory that Vic really was psychic and that dream he was having was some kind of premonition, there's a possible connection you could make with King's novel The Shining, like perhaps Vic had some form of the Shine, the same psychic powers as Dick Harlan and Danny Torrance. And going with that theory, perhaps Tad was a Shiner as well, and assuming the monster in his closet was not imaginary, perhaps his shine allowed him to sense whatever supernatural presence was in his closet. Or perhaps he really was having some kind of premonition of what was to come, and this premonition was simply manifesting itself as a monster in his closet. Admittedly, that is getting into fan theory territory, but because so many of Stephen King's books are supposed to be in the same continuity, I don't think it's a completely invalid theory. Now, the events of this novel would later be referenced in Stephen King's novella The Body, which is also set in Castle Rock. Now, technically that book is set prior to the events of Cujo, because it's set in the early 60s, but the whole novel is told in past tense from the point of view of an adult Gordy reflecting back on his childhood, and there's a certain point where Gordy is talking about Chomper, and he says that Chomper was the most feared dog in Castle Rock, until Joe Camper's dog Cujo went rabid several years later. And I remember when I first read The Body as a teenager, that was the first Stephen King book I read where I started to notice the connections between his work, and that just blew my freaking mind. I was like, what? You mean they're in the same universe? There's also a character in that book named Constable Bannerman who is heavily implied to be George Bannerman, obviously before he became sheriff. There's also a part in Pet Sematary where Judd mentions to Lewis that a few years earlier a St. Bernard went rabid a few towns over. There's a part in It where Beverly makes reference to a serial killer from Castle Rock who murdered all these women, and she's obviously referring to the character of Frank Dodd from from both this and the Dead Zone. But there's actually another, less obvious connection between Cujo and It. In It, there's a flashback to when Bill was in college and he had this really snobbish writing professor, and it mentions how one of his classmates did this experimental play where each character in the play would just say one word, and by the end of the play it all makes up one sentence. And in Cujo it mentions that Steve Kemp wrote a play where each character speaks one word, and if you read both novels, King is heavily insinuating that Bill Denbrough and Steve Kemp were classmates. The events of this novel would also go on to be referenced in The Dark Half and Needful Things. Stephen King wrote a novella called The Sundog, which I haven't read yet, but from what I understand about that book, I think it's about this camera where each time you take a picture, it takes a picture of a dog, and with each picture you take, the dog is getting closer and closer to you. Now, I haven't read it yet, so I'm probably completely screwing up the plot line, but I think the implication you're supposed to get, especially because that book is also set in Castle Rock, I think you're supposed to get the implication that the camera is haunted by the ghost of Cujo. Now, if we consider the minor connections between Cujo and It, that would also loosely connect Cujo with Stephen King's Dark Tower series, because It has some major Dark Tower connections. And from what I remember, there actually was Cujo reference in the final Dark Tower novel. Now, the Dark Tower is also supposed to bridge virtually all of Stephen King's other books and short stories into the same multiverse. Now, if we want to tie Cujo in further with the Dark Tower series, admittedly this is pure fan speculation, but the main antagonist of the Dark Tower is this interdimensional demon called the Crimson King, who, while he does have a physical form that resides in Midworld, which is the alternate universe that most of the Dark Tower series takes place in, it's heavily implied that the true essence of the Crimson King is sort of omnipresent throughout the entire multiverse, and he spreads evil and chaos throughout the universes. He's basically Satan. And a lot of Stephen King fans speculate that the Crimson King is actually the unseen overarching antagonist of King's entire body of work, that he's sort of secretly working behind the scenes, orchestrating the events of King's other novels. So, if we go with that theory, even though Frank Dodd and Cujo were not overtly supernatural, perhaps the Crimson King was secretly pulling their strings. Now, Cujo was adapted into a 1983 film of the same name, but before I talk about the movie, I want to cut to my friend Christian Feliciano, giving his thoughts on Cujo, and he actually has a very different opinion on this book than I did.
When it comes to Cujo, I really don't like this book. Cujo is one of my least favorite Stephen King books. I think my least favorite is The Shining. I like most of Stephen King's books. I think he's a fantastic writer. It's just that for some reason I just cannot get into a couple of his books. Even his most famous ones like Cujo. For some reason I just can't get into it. I found it very boring. I really just couldn't get into the story, the drama with the family, and the whole thing that the wife is cheating on the husband, and then you could kind of take that as, why later on, at the end of the book, why what happens to the wife. It's like, I don't know, I just couldn't get into it. Now, what I did find cool about it, to say something positive, is that this does connect to the rest of Stephen King's universe. If you read The Dead Zone, it connects to this book. And I won't spoil what that is, but if you read it, if you read The Dead Zone, then you read this, you'll understand parts of this book, parts of the mythology of this book. And I really like that about Stephen King. I think that he does a great job of connecting his universe. He was doing it way before a lot of people were. I don't know if that's just his love of comic books. I don't know what that is, but I love it. I love when universes connect. I think that it's fantastic that there's a Stephen King universe out there where different books connect to different books. I just like that. I think it's really cool. But this book, I found it really boring. I don't know. I was just bored out of my mind trying to read it. And I don't know if it's just me, but the same thing with The Shining. You know what I mean? Like, when it comes to The Shining, I was just bored out of my mind. And it's not like the book is that long either. It's probably one of his shortest books. It's not as short as Carrie, but it's not, The Shining it's not The Shining, The Stand, or It, or any of those other really long books, like 11/22/63 or anything like that. But for some reason, I just couldn't get into it. I just was bored. Everything that was going on, whether it was violence or just a story with the family, I just couldn't get into it. It's written, prose-wise, it's written well. Stephen King is a master at writing a story. He knows how to describe things. He knows how to write dialogue. I have nothing against that at all. Like I said, I just didn't like this book. But yeah, that's all I really can say about it. Unfortunately, I don't like this book. I'm going to try eventually to read it again and see if maybe, the third time's the charm, and maybe I will like it. Because that has happened to me before. I have read books a couple of times, I didn't like them, and then maybe the third or fourth time I end up liking them. And I think that Stephen King has given me enough joy that I think I should put the effort into trying to like this book and just keep trying until I like it. And I've done it before. There were a couple of his books. I'm trying to think of one in particular. Unfortunately, right now, I can't remember for some reason. But, I gave those books another chance, and then I really liked them. So I will continue to try to like Cujo until I like it. And yeah, thank you so much for listening to my review. Bye-bye.
So, in 1983, we had the film adaptation of Cujo, directed by Louis Teague, who prior to that directed Alligator, and he would go on to direct another Stephen King-related property, Cat's Eye. Now, I've seen parts of the movie on television years ago, but I saw the movie in its entirety for the first time a few weeks ago, and I enjoyed the movie quite a bit. I can't say it's great by any means, and it's certainly not one of my favorite Stephen King adaptations, but it is a solid, well-made little horror film. And the movie actually followed the book a little closer than I thought it was going to, and it did a good job at truncating what it did take from the book and leaving out what didn't necessarily have to be there. Like, the movie cut out all the references to the Dead Zone, which made sense because when you're doing an adaptation, you're making it as much for people who haven't read the book as you are for people who have. And while all the connections to the Dead Zone worked well in the book, for mainstream audiences at the time, I think it would have really confused people. Now, this actually did come out the same year as David Cronenberg's adaptation of The Dead Zone, but the two movies are completely standalone. The movie also excised a lot of the overt supernatural elements from the book, but surprisingly, it did leave in a little bit of that stuff. Now, probably the most significant change that the movie made was the ending. Let's just say that the movie has a significantly happier ending than the book did, and Stephen King, from what I understand, actually does prefer the movie's ending over the book's ending. Now, the film starred Dee Wallace as Donna, who did a fantastic job in the movie. Now, most people would recognize Dee Wallace as the mother from E.T., but she's really well known to horror fans because of her role in this movie, as well as her roles in Joe Dante's The Howling and Peter Jackson's The Frighteners. You also had Danny Pintaro, I think is his last name, as Tad, and child actors are always hit or miss, but I think he did a really good job in the movie, and there are points where it really does seem like this kid is genuinely scared. You also had Daniel Hugh Kelly as Vic, who is kind of the weak link of the film. He's not bad by any means, but you don't really get to know Vic as well in the film as you do in the book. The movie also features Christopher Stone, who was actually married to Dee Wallace at the time, as Steve Kemp. And Steve is just as much a creep in the movie as he is in the book. You also had Ed Lauder as Joe Camper. The movie also had Sandy Ward as Sheriff Bannerman, the only real connection to the Dead Zone that the movie left in. However, unless you're paying attention to the character's name, and unless you read the book, you would never guess in a million years that this is the same character that Tom Skerritt played in the Dead Zone. Now, in the film, Cujo is played both by a real dog and by a guy in a dog suit, and to the movie's credit, when watching it, I really couldn't tell when they were using the real dog and when they were using the guy in the dog costume. And I gotta say, in the movie, when you finally see Cujo succumb to the rabies, they do a great job at making this dog look genuinely terrifying. Now, the whole story of Cujo has become really ingrained into pop culture to a point where even people who have never read the book or have seen the movie know the story of Cujo. And, like, whenever people would see, like, a dog acting up or a dog acting really vicious, they would call it Cujo as kind of a joke, and in a way it's become kind of a pop culture meme, even predating the internet. Now, I already mentioned Cat's Eye, and Cujo actually would make a cameo in the beginning of that film as sort of an in-joke. Now, a few years ago, you had the Hulu series Castle Rock, which is based on the town of Castle Rock from this novel and several of Stephen King's other books, and the events of Cujo were actually referenced in that show. And to go back to the pop culture references to this story, there was a show on Nickelodeon called Danny Phantom, and there was a ghost dog who showed up in a few episodes of that show that was literally called Cujo. Now, there have been some talks of doing another film adaptation of Cujo, and personally, I think if they do that, it would have to be set in the 80s, because I don't think this story can really work in the modern era, because now we have things like cell phones and the internet. One phone call and this whole story's over with. But yeah, that was my review on Cujo by Stephen King, and long days and pleasant nights to you.